When did you last watch someone disappear from your life without a single word of explanation? Think about the relationship that was warm for months and then, without warning, went cold. No fight, no final conversation, just silence where a person used to be. Think about the friend who stopped replying the exact weak things between you got more honest than usual. Think about the coworker or collaborator who vanished mid-project, right after you'd finally opened up about something that mattered. You have felt this before. You replayed the last few messages, searching for the sentence that broke something. You blamed yourself for being too much, too needy, too honest, too soon. You built an entire theory of what you did wrong out of nothing but silence. Because silence gives you no other material to work with. There is a gap between the story you've built about why they left and what actually happened inside them. Most people live inside that gap for months, sometimes years, without ever naming it. It shows up physically, a tightness behind the sternum every time your phone buzzes, a restlessness that has no name, a low static hum of dread whenever a conversation starts to go somewhere real. John Bowlby, in 1969, writing in Attachment and Loss, Volume 1, described a mechanism he called avoidant deactivation, the process by which a person's attachment system, under the stress of real intimacy, shuts itself down rather than confronts it, and the person disappears instead of speaking. Closeness doesn't get negotiated. It gets switched off silently from the inside. This is worse than simple rejection. It is not that they decided you weren't worth staying for. Plenty of people stay with partners they've decided that about. This is quieter and stranger than that. Not rejection, not indifference, not cruelty. Avoidant deactivation, a nervous system in retreat, mistaking your closeness for danger and choosing disappearance over the vulnerability of saying so. This video is going to show you the mechanism. Bowlby discovered why some people vanish instead of leaving honestly. What is actually happening inside them in the moment they go quiet, and what it means for the story you've been telling yourself about your own part in it. Here is the reversal that should unsettle you a little. The people who ghost most often are not the ones who cared least. They are very often the ones whose system panicked hardest at how much they'd started to care by the end of this video. You won't need their explanation to make sense of what happened. You'll already have one that fits the evidence better than the one you built alone. You think of yourself as the reason they left. Bowlby would tell you that you were more likely the trigger for a system that was never built to stay present under closeness at all. In Attachment and Loss, Bowlby argued that the attachment system is not a personality trait, but a regulatory circuit, wired in early life to manage the balance between closeness and safety. In someone with an avoidant pattern, that circuit was calibrated early to treat increasing intimacy as increasing risk. The way a smoke detector calibrated too sensitively will trip on steam from a shower. The alarm isn't measuring your behavior accurately. It's measuring a threat that was real once in a much earlier context and never got recalibrated. Watch for 4 symptoms in the person who ghosts, because they are the visible edge of an invisible current running underneath. First, the disappearance tends to arrive right after a moment of real closeness, a vulnerable conversation, an "I love you," a plan that made the relationship suddenly feel solid and real. Second, there's often no proportional trigger, no fight, no betrayal, nothing you can point to that would explain and exit this total. Third, the silence is usually total and immediate, not a gradual fade. Because deactivation isn't a decision made slowly. It's closer to a reflex firing all at once. Fourth, if they ever do resurface, it's typically framed as confusion or overwhelm rather than as any specific complaint about you. Because there often wasn't one. Bowlby's broader claim was that attachment behavior is not chosen consciously in the moment it activates. It behaves less like a decision and more like a trained reflex, firing beneath awareness. The same way a hand pulls back from heat before the brain finishes registering pain. There is a second, hidden cost buried inside this dynamic, and it belongs to you, not to them. Every time you absorb someone's disappearance as proof of your own unworthiness, you don't just carry the loss of that relationship. You teach your own nervous system to expect abandonment the next time real closeness starts to form. This compounds. The next relationship that gets close enough to matter gets read unconsciously through the lens of the last one that vanished, and you start protecting yourself early, before anyone's even given you a reason to. Here is a self-audit. Think of the last time someone went quiet on you unexpectedly. Ask yourself honestly, did you interpret that silence as information about them? Or did you immediately convert it into a verdict about you? Most people run through this exercise for the first time, are surprised by how automatically the second happens. Individually, each ghosting is small enough to rationalize on its own. Counted together across a dating history or a friendship history, the pattern of self-blame is no longer subtle. It's simply been accumulating in installments too small to register as a single distorted story. There is a healthy version of processing this and a destructive one. The healthy version can hold they left because their own system panicked, and this still hurt at the same time, without collapsing the two into "I am the reason." The destructive version treats every disappearance as fresh evidence in an ongoing trial against your own worth. Here is the one-line diagnostic. If the hurt fades into a specific memory over time, it's healthy grief. If it hardens into a growing case file used against yourself in future relationships, it's no longer processing, it's indictment. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Blaming yourself for someone's disappearance doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like the only responsible way to make sense of what happened. Bowlby, in A Secure Base, argued that the mind, under threat of loss, will often construct a coherent story rather than tolerate the discomfort of an incoherent one. And a story where you did something wrong is, strangely, more comfortable than a story with no explanation at all. Choosing self-blame over uncertainty is not a neutral act. It is itself a bet, a quiet, standing claim that a bad explanation is safer to hold than no explanation. Even when the bad explanation is inaccurate, the structure that keeps this self-blame alive is almost elegant in its design. It's unfalsifiable by construction, since the person who left never explained themselves. There is no fact that can ever disprove your theory of what you did wrong. The silence itself becomes proof, endlessly reinterpretable to fit whatever story you already believe. And the threshold for evidence, "I'm not to blame," keeps moving. Today, it's, "They'd have to tell me directly it wasn't my fault. And if they somehow did," the goalposts would shift toward needing them to prove it through actions or needing to hear it more than once. The belief is never actually tested against Bowlby's actual model of what deactivation is. It is only ever protected from it. Here is a practical diagnostic. Look at the last time you held this exact belief. They left because of something specifically wrong with me in a comparable situation. What actually happened when you eventually learned more? Most people run through this exercise honestly, find that the fuller story, when it does surface, rarely matches the self-blaming version at all. It usually involves the other person's own history, their own unresolved fear of closeness, entirely apart from anything you did. The first real exit from this self-blame is not self-esteem, and it is not a slogan. It is simply seeing the belief for what it is, a coping story built to manage uncertainty, not an accurate report of what happened inside someone else's nervous system. Notice how the belief recruits allies. It borrows the language of accountability, so blaming yourself feels like maturity rather than distortion. It borrows the language of self-improvement, so building an entire personality renovation around someone else's silence feels productive rather than misdirected. This is what makes it so durable. A belief that announced itself honestly. I am inventing a reason because I cannot tolerate not having one would be easy to see through. A belief dressed as growth is not. Think of this as a ledger. On one side, the cost of accepting that someone's disappearance was about their own deactivated attachment system. Not a verdict on you, a brief, finite discomfort. The strange vertigo of losing a story you'd built a lot of meaning around. On the other side, the cost of continuing to hold yourself responsible, diffuse, invisible, and compounding, charged to you in small installments you barely notice you're paying. Give that invisible cost some texture. It's the hours spent rereading old messages, hunting for the sentence that caused it. It's the caution you now bring into every new closeness, pulling back half a step before anyone gives you a reason to, just in case. It's the version of yourself you edit down in early relationships, quieter, less honest, less available because some part of you has decided that being fully yourself is what makes people vanish. Bowlby wrote about the way early attachment injuries, left unexamined, don't stay contained to their original context. They generalize, shaping how a person approaches every subsequent bond. Every relationship where you carry unexamined self-blame from a previous disappearance pulls resources from your capacity to be present in the one happening now. Here is the inversion. Stated plainly, the cost of accepting the real explanation that their system, not your worth, was the mechanism, is cheaper than what you are already paying to keep protecting a story that blames you. Run that backward through your own history. How long have you actually been carrying the specific belief that you did something wrong in a relationship that simply ended in silence? A year? Longer. Multiply that stretch of time by the small daily tax of half-guarding yourself in every new connection since, and the total cost dwarfs the one-time discomfort of simply letting the self-blaming story go. There's a consistent pattern among people who finally do let it go. The cost was real. A few days of grief for the story itself. A strange disorientation at not having someone to blame, including yourself, but it was almost always smaller than expected, because the anticipation of that discomfort had been doing most of the damage. The tax was never really the letting go. The tax was the years spent holding on. Look at the ledger one more time, this time with real entries instead of abstractions. The message you didn't send to someone new, because a part of you was still guarding against a repeat of the last disappearance. The friendship you kept at arm's length, priced not by what that person had actually shown you, but by what a stranger showed you months or years earlier. None of these were single, catastrophic losses. Each one was small enough to explain away in isolation. Add them together across a few years, and the total is not small at all. Bowlby drew a distinction that applies directly here between problems that dissolve the moment you have enough information, and problems that don't move no matter how much information you gather. Call this second category, for our purposes, unresolved silence, anxiety, the specific difficulty of not knowing why someone vanished. A difficulty that no amount of theorizing seems able to fix on its own. The mechanism behind unresolved silence, anxiety, is an amplification loop. An explanation you never got doesn't sit still. It generates competing images, alternate versions of what you must have done. And those images get more vivid, not less. The longer you hold them without ever being able to test them against reality, you imagine that you said something specific that crossed a line. And the longer you sit with that story, the more concrete and detailed the imagined offense becomes, until you can practically hear the exact sentence you think ruined everything. You imagine that you were fundamentally too much for them, and the longer you sit with that fear, the more it expands from too much for that person into too much for anyone. You imagine that the next person who gets close will eventually do the same thing for the same unnamed reason. And the longer you rehearse that scenario, the more inevitable the next disappearance starts to feel before it's even happened. Here is the counterintuitive finding. More time spent theorizing does not produce more clarity. It produces a more elaborate, more convincing, and more inaccurate story. The version of what you did wrong gets worse in your head every week you keep building it. But because your unchecked imagination has nothing else to work with besides silence, the exit here is mechanical, not psychological. Act at the first real opportunity, the next time you catch yourself constructing a new detail in the theory of your own fault. Not at the point where you finally feel like you've solved the mystery, because that point does not arrive on its own, and the mystery was never solvable from your side alone. Readiness to let the story go, it turns out, is retrospective. It is not a precondition for stopping the theorizing. It is a byproduct that shows up after you've already stopped once. Describing what just happened rather than permitting it in advance. Here's a metaphor worth correcting. You've probably been picturing getting over it as a door, something you walk through once, into a version of yourself that no longer flinches at silence. That's the wrong image. The right one is a different version of the self, built the same way any trained capacity is built, through repetition, not through a single threshold crossing. Bowlby described attachment patterns not as fixed traits, handed to you permanently at birth, but as internal working models, trained patterns of expectation, built through repeated experience and capable of being rebuilt the same way. This matters here because it means your own capacity to hold someone left. And it wasn't a verdict on me, isn't something you either have or don't. It's something you build, one instance at a time. There's a behavioral principle underneath this. Resolutions that stay purely internal, private realizations. Quiet decisions to stop blaming yourself produce essentially no lasting change on their own. Only enacted resolutions. Ones that touch actual behavior. The next time closeness with someone new starts to form, reorganize anything. You can decide privately 100 times that the last disappearance wasn't your fault, and nothing will shift until that decision shows up the next time you're tempted to hold back out of old caution. So here is one concrete instruction, doable in the next 24 hours. The next time you notice yourself pulling back slightly from someone new, softening a message, delaying a reply, editing down something honest you wanted to say the honest thing anyway, in a small, low-stakes way. Not a grand declaration. One sentence you would have normally trimmed down out of old caution. Act at the first real opportunity, not the best one. This matters because delay doesn't just cost you time. It lets the old caution reorganize. The version of you that edits itself down out of fear gets stronger every time it succeeds, and weaker every time it doesn't. The first available moment is always the cheapest one to act in, because the old defense hasn't had time to regroup. This is not a one-time fix. It's a repeated small transaction. The same way any trained capacity is built, not by one grand act of vulnerability, but by a pattern of small, honest ones performed consistently. The first time you let an honest sentence stand instead of trimming it, it will feel exposed, almost reckless. That's expected. Not a sign you're doing it wrong. The 10th time, it will feel closer to neutral. By the 50th, staying present through closeness will feel less like a risk you're managing and more like an accurate description of how you already show up in the world. The relationship where you're fully present without the old bracing for disappearance is not hidden from you. It's not buried somewhere you need to excavate. Something specific already surfaced while you were watching this. A name. A silence you've been carrying. A version of yourself you edit down before anyone's even given you a reason to. You know which one it is. Bowlby's larger point extends well past this single mechanism. He argued that unresolved loss doesn't announce itself as loss. It disguises itself as caution, as realism, as simply knowing how people are, when often what's actually happening is an old, unprocessed wound quietly running the show, mistaken for wisdom about human nature in general. The real problem was never that someone left without explanation. Silence, on its own, is just an absence of information. The real problem is the gap between that absence and the story you filled it with, the space where a genuine loss got quietly converted into permanent evidence against your own worth. Here's the chronic vicissitude reframe. Continuing to hold yourself responsible for someone else's deactivation doesn't reduce the pain of that original loss. It only spreads that same pain out over a much longer stretch of time, taxing every new relationship a little for years, instead of grieving the original one fully once and setting it down. Courage in this framing is not something you need to locate before you let the self-blame go. Courage is a product of motion. It shows up after the first honest sentence you don't edit down, not before it, the same way readiness does. This isn't a claim that the original loss didn't hurt or that it shouldn't have. Grief for a relationship that ended without explanation is real grief, and it deserves to be felt fully rather than argued away. What Bowlby's model offers is not an excuse to skip that grief. It's a more accurate target for it. You can mourn the relationship completely while refusing to let it silence. Keep writing the story of who you are in every relationship that comes after it. Think back to the name, the silence, the edited down version of yourself that came to mind earlier. Picture the next ordinary moment when closeness with someone starts to form and the old caution rises automatically. Picture yourself staying present in it instead of quietly protecting yourself from a disappearance that hasn't happened. That single, small, undramatic choice is the entire mechanism this video has been describing. Not a revelation, not a breakthrough, just one instance followed by another, until the pattern that used to run automatically toward self-blame starts running automatically toward presence instead. You know what you need to do. You know that you know. You know that the silence never actually told you what you decided it meant. You know that the only thing left unresolved is whether you'll let yourself stop finishing that sentence for them. Their silence was never your verdict.